Section 11, parts 59 through 63 of The Painted Veil by Somerset Maugham. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Part 59. Kitty fell again into the comfortable routine of her work, and though in the early morning feeling far from well, she had spirit enough not to let it decompose her. She was astonished at the interest the nuns took in her. Sisters who, when she saw them in a corridor, had done no more than bid her good morning, now on a flimsy pretext came into the room in which she was occupied and looked at her, chatting a little, with a sweet and childlike excitement. Sister St. Joseph told her with a repetition which was sometimes tedious, how she had been saying to herself for days past, "Now I wonder," or "I shouldn't be surprised," and then when Kitty fainted, "There can be no doubt, it jumps to the eyes." She told Kitty long stories of her sister-in-law's confinements, which but for Kitty's quick sense of humor would have not been a little alarming. Sister St. Joseph combined in a pleasant fashion the realistic outlook of her upbringing. A river wound through the meadows of her father's farm, and the poplars that stood on its bank trembled in the faintest breeze, with a charming intimacy with religious things. One day, firmly convinced that a heretic could know nothing of such matters, she told Kitty of the Annunciation. "I can never read those lines in the Holy Writ without weeping," she said. "I do not know why, but it gives me such a funny feeling." And then in French, in words that to Kitty sounded unfamiliar and in their precision a trifle cold, she quoted, "And the angel came in unto her and said, Hail, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women." The mystery of birth flew through the convent like a little fitful wind playing among the white blossoms of an orchard. The thought that Kitty was with child disturbed and excited those sterile women. She frightened them a little now, and fascinated them. They looked upon the physical side of her condition with robust common sense, for they were the daughters of peasants and fishermen, but in their childlike hearts was awe. They were troubled by the thought of her burden, and yet happy and strangely exalted. Sister St. Joseph told her that they all prayed for her, and Sister St. Martin had said what a pity it was that she was not a Catholic. But the Mother Superior had reproved her. She said that it was possible to be a good woman, une brave femme, she put it, even though one was Protestant, and le bon Dieu would in some way or other arrange all that. Kitty was both touched and diverted by the interest she aroused, but surprised beyond measure when she found that even the Mother Superior, so austere in her saintliness, treated her with a new complacence. She had always been kind to Kitty, but in a remote fashion. Now she used her with a tenderness in which there was something maternal. Her voice had in it a new and gentle note, and in her eyes was a sudden playfulness as though Kitty were a child who had done a clever and amusing thing. It was oddly moving. Her soul was like a calm gray sea rolling majestically, awe-inspiring in its somber greatness, and then suddenly a ray of sunshine made it alert, friendly, and gay. Often now in the evening she would come and sit with Kitty. "I must take care that you do not tire yourself, mon enfant," she said, making a transparent excuse to herself, "or Dr. Fane will never forgive me. Oh, this British self-control! There he is delighted beyond measure, and when you speak to him of it he becomes quite pale." She took Kitty's hand and patted it affectionately. "Dr. Fane told me that he wished you to go away. but you would not because you could not bear to leave us. That was kind of you, my dear child, and I want you to know we appreciate the help you have been to us. But I think that you did not want to leave him either, and that is better, for your place is by his side, and he needs you. Ah, I do not know what we should have done without that admirable man." "I'm glad to think that he's been able to do something for you," said Kitty. "You must love him with all your heart, my dear. He is a saint." Kitty smiled, and in her heart sighed. There was only one thing she could do for Walter now, and that she could not think how to. She wanted him to forgive her, not for her sake any more, but for his own, for she felt that this alone could give him peace of mind. It was useless to ask him for his forgiveness, and if he had a suspicion that she desired it for his good rather than hers, his stubborn vanity would make him refuse at all costs. It was curious that his vanity now did not irritate her. It seemed natural, and only made her sorrier for him. And the only chance was that some unexpected occurrence might throw him off his guard. She had an idea that he would welcome an uprush of emotion which would liberate him from his nightmare of resentment, but that in his pathetic folly he would fight when it came with all his might against it. Was it not pitiful that men, tarrying so short a space in a world where there was so much pain, should thus torture themselves? Part 60. Though the Mother Superior talked with Kitty not more than 3 or 4 times, and once or twice but 10 minutes, the impression she made upon Kitty was profound. Her character was like a country which on first acquaintance seems grand, but inhospitable, but in which presently you discover smiling little villages among fruit trees in the folds of the majestic mountains, and pleasant ambling rivers that flow kindly through lush meadows. But these comfortable scenes, though they surprise and even reassure you, are not enough to make you feel at home in the land of tawny heights and wind-swept spaces. It would have been impossible to become intimate with the Mother Superior. She had that something impersonal about her which Kitty had felt with the other nuns, even with the good-humored, chatty Sister St. Joseph, but with her it was a barrier which was almost palpable. It gave you quite a curious sensation, chilling but awe-inspiring, that she could walk on the same earth as you, attend to mundane affairs, and yet live so obviously upon a plane you could not reach. She once said to Kitty, "It is not enough that a religious should be continually in prayer with Jesus. She should be herself a prayer." Though her conversation was interwoven with her religion, Kitty felt that this was natural to her, and that no effort was made to influence the heretic. It seemed strange to her that the Mother Superior, with her deep sense of charity, should be content to leave Kitty in a condition of what seemed to her sinful ignorance. One evening the two of them were sitting together. The days were shortening now, and the mellow light of the evening was agreeable and a little melancholy. The Mother Superior looked very tired. Her tragic face was drawn and white. Her fine dark eyes had lost their fire. Her fatigue, perhaps, urged her to a rare mood of confidence. "This is a memorable day for me, my child," she said, breaking from a long reverie, "for this is the anniversary of the day on which I finally determined to enter religion. For 2 years I had been thinking of it, but I had suffered as it were a fear of this calling, for I dreaded that I might be recaptured by the spirit of the world. But that morning when I communicated, I made the vow that I would before nightfall announce my wish to my dear mother. After I had received the Holy Communion, I asked our Lord to give me peace of mind. Thou shalt have it only, the answer seemed to come to me, when thou hast ceased to desire it. The Mother Superior seemed to lose herself in thoughts of the past. That day one of our friends, Madame de Verneau, had left for the Carmel without telling any of her relatives. She knew that they were opposed to her step, but she was a widow and thought that as such she had the right to do as she chose. One of my cousins had gone to bid farewell to the dear fugitive and did not come back till the evening. She was much moved. I had not spoken to my mother. I trembled at the thought of telling her what I had in mind, and yet I wished to keep the resolution I had made at Holy Communion. I asked my cousin all manner of questions. My mother, who appeared to be absorbed in her tapestry, lost no word. While I talked, I said to myself, if I want to speak today, I have not a minute to lose. It is strange how vividly I remember the scene. We were sitting round the table, a round table covered with a red cloth, and we worked by the light of a lamp with a green shade. My two cousins were staying with us, and we were all working at tapestries to recover the chairs in the drawing-room. Imagine, they had not been recovered since the days of Louis XIV, when they were bought, and they were so shabby and faded. My mother said it was a disgrace. I tried to form the words, but my lips would not move. And then suddenly, after a few minutes of silence, my mother said to me, I really cannot understand the conduct of your friend. I do not like this leaving without a word all those to whom she is so dear. The gesture is theatrical and offends my taste. A well-bred woman does nothing which shall make people talk of her. I hope that if ever you caused us the great sorrow of leaving us, you would not take flight as though you were committing a crime. It was the moment to speak, but such was my weakness that I could only say, Ah, set your mind at rest, maman. I should not have the strength. My mother made no answer, and I repented because I had not dared to explain myself. I seemed to hear the word of our Lord to St. Peter, Peter, lovest thou me? Oh, what weakness, what ingratitude was mine! I left my comfort, the manner of my life, my family, and my diversions. I was lost in these bitter thoughts when a little later, as though the conversation had not been interrupted, my mother said to me, Still, my Odette, I do not think that you will die without having done something that will endure. I was still lost in my anxiety and my reflections, while my cousins, never knowing the beating of my heart, worked quietly, when suddenly my mother, letting her tapestry fall and looking at me attentively, said, Ah, my dear child, I am very sure that you will end by becoming a religious. Are you speaking seriously, my good mother? I answered. You are laying bare the innermost thought and desire of my heart. Mais oui, cried my cousins without giving me time to finish. For 2 years Odette has thought of nothing else. But you will not give your permission, ma tante. You must not give your permission. By what right, my dear children, should we refuse it, said my mother, if it is the will of God? My cousins then, wishing to make a jest of the conversation, asked me what I intended to do with the trifles that belonged to me, and quarrelled gaily about which should take possession of this and which of that. But these first moments of gaiety lasted a very little while, and we began to weep. Then we heard my father come up the stairs. The Mother Superior paused for a moment and sighed. It was very hard for my father. I was his only daughter, and men often have a deeper feeling for their daughters than they ever have for their sons." "It is a great misfortune to have a heart," said Kitty, with a smile. "It is a great good fortune to consecrate that heart to the love of Jesus Christ." At that moment a little girl came up to the Mother Superior, and, confident in her interest, showed her a fantastic toy that she had somehow got hold of. The Mother Superior put her beautiful, delicate hand round the child's shoulder, and the child nestled up to her. It moved Kitty to observe how sweet her smile was, and yet how impersonal. "It is wonderful to see the adoration that all your orphans have for you, Mother," she said. "I think I should be very proud if I could excite so great a devotion." The Mother Superior gave once more her aloof and yet beautiful smile. "There's only one way to win hearts, and that is to make oneself like unto those of whom one would be loved." Part 61. Walter did not come back to dinner that evening. Kitty waited for him a little, for when he was detained in the city he always managed to send her word. But at last she sat down. She made no more than a pretense of eating the many courses which the Chinese cook, with his regard for propriety, notwithstanding pestilence and the difficulty of provisioning, invariably set before her, and then, sinking into the long rattan chair by the open window, surrendered herself to the beauty of the starry night. The silence rested her. She did not try to read. Her thoughts floated upon the surface of her mind like little white clouds reflected on a still lake. She was too tired to seize upon one, follow it up, and absorb herself in its attendant train. She wondered vaguely what there was for her in the various impressions which her conversations with the nuns had left upon her. It was singular that, though their way of life so profoundly moved her, the faith which occasioned it left her untouched. She could not envision the possibility that she might at any time be captured by the ardor of belief. She gave a little sigh. Perhaps it would make everything easier if that great white light should illuminate her soul. Once or twice she had had the desire to tell the Mother Superior of her unhappiness and its cause. But she dared not. She could not bear that this austere woman should think ill of her. To her what she had done would naturally seem a grievous sin. The odd thing was that she herself could not regard it as wicked so much as stupid and ugly. Perhaps it was due to an obtusiveness in herself that she looked upon her connection with Townsend as regrettable and shocking even, but to be forgotten rather than to be repented of. It was like making a blunder at a party. There was nothing to do about it. It was dreadfully mortifying, but it showed a lack of sense to ascribe too much importance to it. She shuddered as she thought of Charlie with his large frame too well covered, the vagueness of his jaw, and the way he had of standing with his chest thrown out so that he might not seem to have a pouch. His sanguine temperament showed itself in the little red veins which soon would form a network on his ruddy cheeks. She had liked his bushy eyebrows. There was to her in them now something animal and repulsive. And the future. It was curious how indifferent it left her. She could not see into it at all. Perhaps she would die when the baby was born. Her sister Doris had always been much stronger than she, and Doris had nearly died. She had done her duty and produced an heir to the new baronetcy. Kitty smiled as she thought of her mother's satisfaction. If the future was so vague, it meant perhaps that she was destined never to see it. Walter would probably ask her mother to take care of the child, if the child survived, and she knew well enough to be sure that, however uncertain of his paternity, he would treat it with kindness. Walter could be trusted under any circumstances to behave admirably. It was a pity that with his great qualities, his unselfishness and honor, his intelligence and sensibility, he should be so unlovable. She was not in the least frightened of him now, but sorry for him, and at the same time she could not help thinking him slightly absurd. The depth of his emotion made him vulnerable, and she had a feeling that somehow and at some time she could so work upon it as to induce him to forgive her. The thought haunted her now that in thus giving him peace of mind she would make the only possible amends for the anguish she had caused him. It was a pity he had so little sense of humor. She could see them both some day laughing together at the way they had tormented themselves. She was tired. She took the lamp into her room and undressed. She went to bed and presently fell asleep. Part 62. But she was awakened by a loud knocking. At first, since it was interwoven with the dream from which she was aroused, she could not attach the sound to reality. The knocking went on, and she was conscious that it must be at the gateway of the compound. It was quite dark. She had a watch with phosphorized hands, and saw that it was 2:30. It must be Walter coming back. How late he was! And he could not awake the boy. The knocking went on, louder and louder, and in the silence of the night it was really not a little alarming. The knocking stopped, and she heard the withdrawing of the heavy bolt. Walter had never come back so late. Poor thing, he must be tired out. She hoped he would have the sense to go straight to bed instead of working as usual in that laboratory of his. There was a sound of voices, and people came into the compound. That was strange, for Walter, coming home late in order not to disturb her, took pains to be quiet. 2 or 3 persons ran swiftly up the wooden steps and came into the room next door. Kitty was a little frightened. At the back of her mind was always the fear of an anti-foreign riot. Had something happened? Her heart began to beat quickly. But before she had time to put her vague apprehension into shape, someone walked across the room and knocked at her door. "Mrs. Fane?" She recognized Waddington's voice. "Yes, what is it?" "Will you get up at once? I have something to say to you." She rose and put on a dressing gown. She unlocked the door and opened it. Her glance took in Waddington in a pair of Chinese trousers and a pongee coat, the houseboy holding a hurricane lamp, and a little farther back 3 Chinese soldiers in khaki. She started as she saw the consternation on Waddington's face. His head was tousled as though he had just jumped out of bed. "What's the matter?" she gasped. "You must keep calm. There's not a moment to lose. Put on your clothes at once and come with me." "But what is it? Has something happened in the city?" The sight of the soldiers suggested to her at once that there had been an outbreak, and they were come to protect her. "Your husband's been taken ill. We want you to come at once." "Walter?" she cried. "You mustn't be upset. I don't exactly know what's the matter. Colonel Yu sent this officer to me and asked me to bring you to the Yamen at once." Kitty stared at him for a moment. She felt a sudden cold in her heart, and then she turned. "I shall be ready in 2 minutes." "I came just as I was," he answered. "I was asleep. I just put on a coat and some shoes." She did not hear what he said. She dressed by the light of the stars, taking the first things that came to hand. Her fingers on a sudden were so clumsy that it seemed to take her an age to find the little clasp that closed her dress. She put round her shoulders the Cantonese shawl she had worn in the evening. "I haven't put a hat on. There's no need, is there?" "No." The boy held the lantern in front of them, and they hurried down the steps and out of the compound gate. "Take care you don't fall," said Waddington. "You'd better hang on to my arm." The soldiers followed immediately behind them. "Colonel Yu has sent chairs. They are waiting on the other side of the river." They walked quickly down the hill. Kitty could not bring herself to utter the question that trembled so horribly on her lips. She was mortally afraid of the answer. They came to the bank, and there, with a thread of light at the bow, a sampan was waiting for them. "Is it cholera?" she said then. "I am afraid so." She gave a little cry and stopped short. "I think you ought to come as quickly as you can." He gave her his hand to help her into the boat. The passage was short and the river almost stagnant. They stood in a bunch at the bow, while a woman with a child tied on her hip with one oar impelled the sampan across. "He was taken ill this afternoon. The afternoon of yesterday, that is," said Waddington. "Why wasn't I sent for at once?" Although there was no reason for it, they spoke in whispers. In the darkness Kitty could only feel how intense was her companion's anxiety. "Colonel Yu wanted to, but he wouldn't let him. Colonel Yu has been with him all the time." "He ought to have sent for me all the same. It's heartless." "Your husband knew that you had never seen anyone with cholera. It's a terrible and revolting sight. He didn't want you to see it." "After all, he is my husband," she said in a choking voice. Waddington made no reply. "Why am I allowed to come now?" Waddington put his hand on her arm. "My dear, you must be very brave. You must be prepared for the worst." She gave a wail of anguish and turned away a little, for she saw that the 3 Chinese soldiers were looking at her. She had a sudden strange glimpse of the whites of their eyes. "Is he dying?" "I only know the message Colonel Yu gave to this officer who came and fetched me. As far as I can judge, collapse has set in." "Is there no hope at all?" "I am dreadfully sorry. I am afraid that if we don't get there quickly, we shan't find him alive." She shuddered. The tears began to stream down her cheeks. "You see, he's been overworking. He has no powers of resistance." She withdrew from the pressure of his arm with a gesture of irritation. It exasperated her that he should talk in that low, anguished voice. They reached the side, and the 2 men, Chinese coolies, standing on the bank, helped her to step on shore. The chairs were waiting. As she got into hers, Waddington said to her, "Try and keep a tight hold on your nerves. You'll want all your self-control. Tell the bearers to make haste. They have orders to go as fast as they can." The officer, already in his chair, passed by, and as he passed called out to Kitty's bearers. They raised the chair smartly, arranged the poles on their shoulders, and at a swift pace set off. Waddington followed close behind. They took the hill at a run, a man with a lantern going before each chair, and at the water gate the gatekeeper was standing with a torch. The officer shouted to him as they approached, and he flung open one side of the gate to let them through. He uttered some sort of interjection as they passed, and the bearers called back. In the dead of the night those guttural sounds in a strange language were mysterious and alarming. They slithered up the wet and slippery cobbles of the alley, and one of the officer's bearers stumbled. Kitty heard the officer's voice raised in anger, the shrill retort of the bearer, and then the chair in front hurried on again. The streets were narrow and tortuous. Here in the city was deep night. It was a city of the dead. They hastened along a narrow lane, turned a corner, and then at a run took a flight of steps. The bearers were beginning to blow hard. They walked with long, rapid strides in silence. One took out a ragged handkerchief, and as he walked wiped from his forehead the sweat that ran down into his eyes. They wound this way and that, so that it might have been a maze through which they sped. In the shadow of the shuttered shops, sometimes a form seemed to be lying, but you did not know whether it was a man who slept to awake at dawn or a man who slept to awake never. The narrow streets were ghostly in their silent emptiness, and when on a sudden a dog barked loudly, it sent a shock of terror through Kitty's tortured nerves. She did not know where they went. The way seemed endless. Could they not go faster? Faster, faster. The time was going, and at any moment it might be too late. Part 63. Suddenly, walking along a blank long wall, they came to a gateway flanked by sentry boxes, and the bearers set down the chairs. Waddington hurried up to Kitty. She had already jumped out. The officer knocked loudly on the door and shouted. A postern was opened, and they passed into a courtyard. It was large and square. Huddled against the walls, under the eaves of the overhanging roofs, soldiers wrapped in their blankets were lying in huddled groups. They stopped for a moment while the officer spoke to a man who might have been a sergeant on guard. He turned and said something to Waddington. "He's still alive," said Waddington in a low voice. "Take care how you walk." Still preceded by the men with lanterns, they made their way across the yard, up some steps, through a great doorway, and then down into another wide court. On one side of this was a long chamber with lights in it. The lights within, shining through the rice paper, silhouetted the elaborate pattern of the lattice. The lantern-bearers led them across the yard towards this room, and at the door the officer knocked. It was opened immediately, and the officer, with a glance at Kitty, stepped back. "Will you walk in?" said Waddington. It was a long, low room, and the smoky lamps that lit it made the gloom ominous. 3 or 4 orderlies stood about. On a pallet against the wall opposite the door, a man was lying huddled under a blanket. An officer was standing motionless at the foot. Kitty hurried up and leaned over the pallet. Walter lay with his eyes closed, and in that sombre light his face had the grayness of death. He was horribly still. "Walter, Walter!" she gasped in a low, terrified tone. There was a slight movement of the body, or the shadow of a movement. It was so slight it was like a breath of air which you cannot feel, and yet for an instant ruffles the surface of still water. "Walter, Walter, speak to me." The eyes were opened slowly, as though it were an infinite effort to raise those heavy lids. But he did not look. He stared at the wall a few inches from his face. He spoke. His voice, low and weak, had the hint of a smile in it. "This is a pretty kettle of fish," he said. Kitty dared not breathe. He made no further sound, no beginning of a gesture. But his eyes, those dark, cold eyes of his, seeing now what mysteries, stared at the whitewashed wall. Kitty raised herself to her feet. With haggard gaze she faced the man who stood there. "Surely something can be done. You're not going to stand there and do nothing." She clasped her hands. Waddington spoke to the officer who stood at the end of the bed. "I'm afraid they've done everything that was possible. The regimental surgeon has been treating him. Your husband has trained him, and he's done all that your husband could do himself." "Is that the surgeon?" "No, that's Colonel Yu. He's never left your husband's side." Distracted, Kitty gave him a glance. He was a tallish man, but stockily built, and he seemed ill at ease in his khaki uniform. He was looking at Walter, and she saw that his eyes were wet with tears. It gave her a pang. Why should that man with his yellow, flat face have tears in his eyes? It exasperated her. "It's awful to be able to do nothing." "At least he's not in pain any more," said Waddington. She leaned once more over her husband. Those ghastly eyes of his still stared vacantly in front of him. She could not tell if he saw with them. She did not know whether he had heard what was said. She put her lips close to his ears. "Walter, isn't there something we can do?" She thought there must be some drug they could give him which would stay the dreadful ebbing of his life. Now that her eyes were more accustomed to the dimness, she saw with horror that his face had fallen. She could hardly have recognized him. It was unthinkable that in a few short hours he should look like another man. He hardly looked like a man at all. He looked like death. She thought that he was making an effort to speak. She put her ear close. "Don't fuss. I've had a rough passage, but I'm all right now." Kitty waited for a moment, but he was silent. His immobility rent her heart with anguish. It was terrifying that he should lie so still. He seemed prepared already for the stillness of the grave. Someone, the surgeon or a dresser, came forward and with a gesture motioned her aside. He leaned over the dying man and with a dirty rag wet his lips. Kitty stood up once more and turned to Waddington despairingly. "Is there no hope at all?" she whispered. He shook his head. "How much longer can he live?" "No one can tell. An hour, perhaps." Kitty looked round the bare chamber, and her eyes rested for an instant on the substantial form of Colonel Hugh. "Can I be left alone with him for a little while?" she asked. "Only for a minute." "Certainly, if you wish it." Waddington stepped over to the Colonel and spoke to him. The Colonel gave a little bow and then in a low tone an order. "We shall wait on the steps," said Waddington as they trooped out. "You have only to call." Now that the incredible had overwhelmed her consciousness, like a drug coursing through her veins, and she realized that Walter was going to die, she had but one thought, and that was to make his end easier for him by dragging from his soul the rancor which poisoned it. If he could die at peace with her, it seemed to her that he would die at peace with himself. She thought now not of herself at all, but only of him. "Walter, I beseech you to forgive me," she said, leaning over him. For fear that he could not bear the pressure, she took care not to touch him. "I'm so desperately sorry for the wrong I did you. I so bitterly regret it." He said nothing. He did not seem to hear. She was obliged to insist. It seemed to her strangely that his soul was a fluttering moth, and its wings were heavy with hatred. "Darling." A shadow passed over his wan and sunken face. It was less than a movement, and yet it gave all the effect of a terrifying convulsion. She had never used that word to him before. Perhaps in his dying brain there passed the thought, confused and difficultly grasped, that he had only heard her use it, a commonplace of her vocabulary to dogs and babies and motor cars. Then something horrible occurred. She clenched her hands, trying with all her might to control herself, for she saw 2 tears run slowly down his wasted cheeks. "Oh, my precious, my dear, if you ever loved me, I know you loved me, and I was hateful. I beg you to forgive me. I've no chance now to show my repentance. Have mercy on me. I beseech you to forgive." She stopped. She looked at him, all breathless, waiting passionately for a reply. She saw that he tried to speak. Her heart gave a great bound. It seemed to her that it would be in a manner a reparation for the suffering she had caused him if at this last moment she could effect his deliverance from that load of bitterness. His lips moved. He did not look at her. His eyes stared unseeing at the whitewashed wall. She leaned over him so that she might hear. But he spoke quite clearly. "The dog it was that died." She stayed as still as though she were turned to stone. She could not understand and gazed at him in terrified perplexity. It was meaningless, delirium. He had not understood a word she said. It was impossible to be so still and yet to live. She stared. His eyes were open. She could not tell if he breathed. She began to grow frightened. "Walter," she whispered. "Walter." At last, suddenly, she raised herself. A sudden fear seized her. She turned and went to the door. "Will you come, please? He doesn't seem to—" They stepped in. The Chinese surgeon went up to the bed. He had an electric torch in his hand, and he lit it and looked at Walter's eyes. Then he closed them. He said something in Chinese. Waddington put his arm around Kitty. "I'm afraid he's dead." Kitty gave a deep sigh. A few tears fell from her eyes. She felt dazed rather than overcome. The Chinese stood about round the bed, helplessly, as though they did not quite know what to do next. Waddington was silent. In a minute the Chinese began to speak in a low tone among themselves. "You'd better let me take you back to the bungalow," said Waddington. "He'll be brought there." Kitty passed her hand wearily across her forehead. She went up to the pallet bed and leaned over it. She kissed Walter gently on the lips. She was not crying now. "I'm sorry to give you so much trouble." The officers saluted as she passed, and she gravely bowed. They walked back across the courtyard and got into their chairs. She saw Waddington light a cigarette. A little smoke lost in the air. That was the life of a man. End of section 11.